I was 66 years old the day I realized I'd been demoted to an afterthought in the life of the boy I once held against my chest through fevers and nightmares. Now a grown man in tailored navy walking past me like I was housekeeping. The venue was grand. Polished oak floors, crystal chandeliers, hors d'oeuvres served on marble slabs. But none of it dulled the sting of the place card, with my name scribbled onto a wobbling table beside the industrial-sized ice bucket. The hum of the mini-fridge behind the bar was louder than the string quartet, and the bartender, a sweet boy named Trevor, apologized 3 times for the smell coming from the nearby trash bin, which had already been emptied twice. I didn't belong there, not in the sense of ego or entitlement, but in the quiet, aching way a mother knows when something sacred has been replaced. Up front, where the candles flickered and champagne flutes caught the light, my ex-husband clinked glasses with his new wife, Diane, who wore the kind of dress you only buy when you want to look like you've always belonged in the center. She had the seat next to Jason, where I once imagined I'd be, hand on his arm, teary-eyed with pride. Instead, I watched him lean over to kiss her cheek, and I sipped lukewarm Prosecco from a plastic flute they hadn't bothered to upgrade for the overflow table. Every so often, guests would glance back at me with the kind of polite discomfort reserved for solo aunts and distant cousins. No one seemed to know where I was meant to be, and no one asked. I smiled through it, the way women of my generation were trained to do, clutching the pearl clutch I'd bought for the occasion and pressing my lips together each time someone made a toast that never included my name. And when Jason looked in my direction, once, briefly, I gave him a small nod, not of approval, but of recognition. He had made his choice. He'd seated me with the refuse, and so I sat, silent and still, like something he was hoping would quietly disappear with the dishes. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. I'd spent weeks searching for that dress, the silk navy one with the scooped back and the quiet elegance of something made to be remembered, but not to compete. A dress meant to honor the moment, not outshine it. It was the color of midnight prayers and deep water, of all the strength I'd poured into raising Jason alone after his father left. And when I'd tried it on in the shop, the saleswoman gasped, said I looked like a queen. But 3 days later, I got a message through one of the bride's friends, a cheery little text that said the bridal party was wearing soft blush tones and champagne hues, and navy might clash, might confuse the color story, whatever that meant. There was no direct request, just the kind of passive suggestion that feels like a door closing in your face. So I folded the dress carefully back into its box, the tissue paper muffling something sharp in my chest, and returned it in silence. I settled instead on a beige lace number that did nothing for my figure and even less for my spirit, the kind of dress you wear when you don't want to be accused of trying too hard. On the wedding day, I walked into the venue and nearly choked. There, under the floral arch during photos, stood Diane, my ex-husband's wife, draped in a navy gown so similar to mine I had to blink twice. Same deep tone, same silhouette, even the same understated neckline. I stared at her across the room, that dress shimmering under chandelier light, and realized I hadn't been asked to change because of the color scheme. I'd been asked to change because someone else had already claimed the shade I'd chosen. They didn't want 2 women in navy, and one of us had power, and one of us had proximity. I stood by the bathroom mirror later, adjusting my sleeves, watching the beige fabric sag against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't recognize myself. It wasn't just the dress they'd stripped from me, it was the dignity that came with being seen. The speeches started just after dessert, when the room was soft with wine and sugar, and the clink of silverware against half-eaten cake, and I watched from the shadows of the ice bucket as people rose to offer tributes full of laughter and long-winded metaphors about love, commitment, and how two families were finally becoming one. The groom's father went first, his voice smooth and rehearsed, praising the bride for her grace and Jason for growing into a man any father would be proud of. He talked about Diane's unwavering support, about how much she had done to plan the event, and how lucky the couple was to have such a mother figure guiding them. I waited for a mention, a flicker of acknowledgement, a breadcrumb that I had not just arrived but existed, but there was nothing, not a syllable. Jason's best man told stories from their college days, the bride's sister cried while recounting their childhood, and the officiant read a poem written by a distant cousin with a microphone too close to his lips. Through it all, Jason barely looked my way. When his eyes did skim the room, they passed over me like I was fogged glass, something that blurred the view but didn't warrant cleaning. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap like I was back in a church pew at a funeral, mourning something that was still alive. My son had become a stranger in rented tuxedo pants, and it dawned on me, quietly, irrevocably, that my role in his life had been reduced to logistics. Make sure mum's invited, seat her somewhere, get her out of the pictures. I was there not as a mother, not as a woman who had raised him through every scraped knee and heartbreak, but as an obligation, a necessary checkbox in the perfect wedding spreadsheet. And as I watched Diane beam under the chandelier light, holding the mic with polished hands, I thought to myself, this wasn't a union of two families. This was an erasure, a rewritten narrative, and I was already being edited out. It was during the clean-up after dinner, when the lights dimmed and the dance floor cleared for the first twirl of a choreographed first dance, that a young waiter, barely old enough to rent a car, muttered something as he passed me a fresh napkin for the condensation pooling beneath my untouched glass of wine. "Can't believe this thing almost got pulled," he said, glancing toward the head table. "Boss said the deposit nearly bounced. Thought we'd lose the date last month." His voice was casual, but something about it sank sharp into my chest, like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. My fingers froze around the glass. A deposit. Last month. And just like that, I was no longer sitting beside the trash. I was standing in the lobby of this very venue in January 2020, wearing a red scarf and signing a contract for a family reunion that never came. COVID had wiped the plans clean, and somewhere between cancelled catering and lost headcounts, the deposit was never refunded. I'd left it, forgotten it even, like so many other things sacrificed in silence. But now, listening to the clatter of plates and the DJ testing his mic with a scratchy "check 1, 2," I felt something curl at the base of my spine, an old instinct that had once helped me stretch $50 across a month when Jason was a toddler and growing faster than my paychecks. I stood slowly, smoothed my skirt, and walked the perimeter of the ballroom until I found the corner office, glass-walled and empty, with a clipboard still bearing the venue's weekly booking sheet. My eyes scanned until they landed on it. Quinn Family Reunion, rescheduled, payment in full. Still in my name, not Diane's, not Jason's, mine. The ink had barely faded. They hadn't transferred the contract. They hadn't even asked. I returned to my seat beside the ice bucket, and suddenly, the Prosecco didn't taste so sour. Because for the first time that evening, I wasn't just the woman they shoved to the side. I was the woman who still owned the room. By the time I slipped out the side entrance and into the cool evening air, the stars had begun to scatter across the sky like broken promises, and my heels clicked against the cobblestone with the rhythm of a woman who had just remembered she hadn't always been invisible. I found a quiet spot near the service drive, away from the music and the laughter and the hollow clink of champagne flutes, and pulled out my phone with fingers steadier than I expected. Marjorie answered on the second ring, her voice the same warm blend of sarcasm and steel it had been since we shared ramen and heartbreak in a college dorm 3 states away. "Loretta?" she said, alert in an instant. "Are you crying or plotting?" "A little of both," I replied. I told her everything, about the table, the dress, the silence in the speeches, and finally about the venue, the deposit, the booking sheet that still had my name inked into its margins. Marjorie didn't gasp or scold. She listened like a woman who had built a career out of listening to women who had been underestimated. "They didn't transfer the contract?" she asked. "Not a thing," I said. "It's all still mine." There was a pause, and then a sound I hadn't heard in years. Marjorie's laugh, low and knowing. "Oh, honey," she said, "they built their castle on your foundation and forgot to change the deed." Within the hour, she had pulled the contract from her archives. She'd helped me review it back in 2020 and confirmed every detail. My name, my deposit, my rights. "Technically," she added, "you're the legal host of this entire affair, which means, I interrupted, a slow fire rising in my chest. "They owe me a very public thank you, or a very private reckoning." I hung up, not angry, not shaken, but clear. The power wasn't in the chandelier-lit speeches, or the monogrammed napkins, or the orchestrated toasts. It was in the overlooked details, the paperwork filed by a woman they had assumed was done leaving a mark. And I was just getting started. I learned about the gown from a woman named Shay, a junior event coordinator with too much coffee in her system and not enough filter in her mouth, who mentioned in passing that the bride's dress, a $12,000 imported lace fantasy, had been left hanging in the bridal suite for overnight pickup by a boutique courier. "They left it under your name, technically," she added, flipping through her clipboard without realizing the weight of what she'd just handed me. And indeed, tucked under the bookings inventory was a single line that read, "1 times bridal gown, private storage, suite 4A. My suite. My contract. My rules." I waited until the staff had begun sweeping crumbs from beneath tables, and the DJ was packing chords, then walked through the hallway lined with dimmed sconces until I reached the door. I expected alarms, locks, resistance. But the universe doesn't always slam the door. Sometimes it swings open and dares you to walk through. The gown hung from a padded hanger, like a secret longing to be worn. Layers of silk and pearl-threaded lace cascading down like a waterfall, frozen mid-fall. I didn't take it to hurt anyone. Not exactly. I took it because once, not long ago, I dared to wear navy silk and been told to dim. I took it because this wedding had cost me more than money, and I was tired of paying in silence. I brought the gown to Mrs. Ellery's shop the next morning. She'd hemmed my work blouses for 30 years and never once asked questions. By noon, it had been tailored to fit my shoulders and hips, which bore the weight of decades and the dignity of survival. I stood before the mirror in that dress, not like a bride, but like a woman who had stopped asking permission to take up space. The lace clung to me, not with fragility, but with intent. When I returned to the venue for the brunch the following day, I wore it beneath a soft grey shawl, my hair swept up, pearls at my neck, and not a trace of apology on my face. Let them stare. Let them whisper. For once, they'd have to see me. It wasn't until I opened my old email account, the one Jason still had access to, the one I hadn't touched since I stopped volunteering at the local shelter, that I saw the travel confirmation buried beneath newsletters and junk mail, with my full name attached to a rewards number I hadn't used since 2018. A honeymoon package, round-trip airfare, ocean view suite, champagne on arrival, the works. And all of it booked under my loyalty points, earned through years of business travel back when I was the only one paying the bills. He hadn't even bothered to ask. Just siphoned what was left from the mother who once stood in line for hours at airline counters just to get him home for Christmas. The destination? A private resort in St. Lucia, where cabanas came with butlers and the sand was combed before sunrise. I stared at the reservation for a long time, letting the pettiness of it wash over me like surf, then opened a new tab and logged in to my travel portal. It took 6 clicks to cancel their entire itinerary, 2 to reassign the points, and another 6 to rebook the suite under a new name. Mine. I paid extra to extend the trip by 3 days. I requested the same champagne and added a massage package. Then I emailed the resort concierge and asked if the ocean-facing balcony had a writing desk. I figured I'd finally start that memoir Marjorie kept nagging me about. I didn't leave a note, didn't warn them, didn't bother to explain. Jason and his new wife would learn at the airport when the tickets wouldn't scan and the lounge staff apologized politely for the error. By then, I'd be 2 piña coladas deep, watching the waves slide into shore with the kind of silence only earned by women who have spent their whole lives giving and finally remember how to take. I wasn't being cruel. I was being corrective. There's a difference. Sometimes revenge is loud and sharp, but sometimes it's as soft as sea foam and booked under your own name. The sun was already high when I arrived, the brunch tent buzzing with forced cheer and the scent of mimosa pulp turning stale in the heat. But there was a noticeable gap at the head table. 2 empty seats marked with calligraphy placecards, Jason and Emily. Guests stirred awkwardly, eyes darting toward the entryway, waiting for their golden couple to arrive, unaware that somewhere between the cancelled flight and the realization that their resort suite had been reassigned, the honeymoon had soured before it ever began. I stepped into the space like I owned it, because in every legal sense I still did, wearing the gown that had once belonged to the bride and now fit me better than silence ever had. The shawl slid from my shoulders as the air caught in people's throats, their confusion bubbling just below the surface, unsure whether to gasp or applaud. I crossed the floor with the calm of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything finally within reach. Murmurs followed me like a tide, but I didn't waver. I picked up a glass from a nearby table, no place card, no escort needed, and turned to face the room. "Good morning," I said, voice steady, full. "You forgot to thank the host." A hush fell, the kind usually reserved for church or courtrooms, and I held it there, letting the truth ripple out between linen-covered tables and monogrammed napkins. "But don't worry," I added, raising the glass. "I'm here now." I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I'd made my point with less venom than they probably deserved, but more grace than they'd ever given. As I walked out, past centerpieces I had indirectly paid for and guests who avoided my gaze, I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. What I felt was something better. Restored. In a room that had once been designed to exclude me, I had taken up space, not with apology, but with presence. And sometimes that's all a woman ever wanted, to be seen, not out of obligation, but with recognition. To be remembered not as someone left off the toast, but as the one who poured the first glass. The call came late, just as the sun dipped beneath the edge of my garden fence, and the sky turned that deep, bruised purple that reminds you how quickly light can vanish. I recognized the number, but let it ring twice before answering, my breath steady, my tea untouched on the windowsill beside me. "Mom!" Jason's voice exploded down the line, raw with disbelief and desperation. "What the hell did you do?" There was no greeting, no question of where I was or if I was okay, just rage in a suit he hadn't earned. He shouted about the venue, the dress, the honeymoon, called it sabotage, said people were talking, said I'd embarrassed him. I listened, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to hear how far he'd drifted. His voice cracked when he mentioned Emily crying, how her parents were furious, how nothing had gone according to plan. That's when I realized he still didn't see it, that I was the plan, the foundation, the silent architect they'd built this fairy tale upon. "I raised you," I said, calm as dusk. "I stayed up through your fevers, worked overtime so you could go on field trips, sold my jewelry to cover your college tuition. I showed up when no one else did. And somewhere along the line, you decided I didn't look right in the pictures." He went quiet. I imagined him sitting in some spare guest room, tie loosened, hands gripping a phone like it could change history. "They bought your silence, Jason," I continued. "You let them rewrite our story. You gave them the spotlight, and I was supposed to smile from the shadows. All I did was take back the bill." I waited for him to argue, but there was nothing, just the low hum of a line stretched too thin and too long. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said finally. "I did this to remember myself." When the silence held, I ended the call. Not with a slam, not with a goodbye. Just a gentle press of the screen, like closing a book that had gone on too long without a real ending. The sand was warm beneath my feet, the kind that sinks just slightly with each step, soft enough to remind you that the world doesn't need to be hard to hold you. I sat alone beneath a woven umbrella, the ocean humming like a lullaby older than any grief I carried, and opened the leather-bound journal I'd packed without quite knowing why. There, with the sun high and the sea stretched endless before me, I began to write. Not for Jason, not for anyone who had edited me out of their narrative, but for myself. These weren't the vows I'd once spoken in a rented hall with borrowed flowers and a smile that ached from being held too long. These were different. These were not promises to be obedient, accommodating, or small. I vowed never again to fold myself to fit someone else's idea of what I should be. I vowed to stop waiting for permission to exist out loud. I vowed to take up space at the tables I built, to wear the dress I chose, to sit by the window or in the center or wherever I damn well pleased. I vowed to never again confuse silence with peace. The waves rolled in, steady and indifferent to ceremony, and I felt no need to cry or dramatize the moment. There was no audience, no spotlight, just me, and the sound of my own pen scratching across the page like a steady heartbeat. I looked up once, half expecting someone to walk toward me, someone with flowers or apologies or explanations. But no one came, and that was the gift. Because in that moment, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was seeing myself, fully, fiercely, finally. I closed the journal, stood, and walked back toward the shoreline, the hem of my linen dress brushing the tide, and felt the water cool around my ankles like a benediction. I had been mother, wife, background noise, financier, afterthought. But here, now, I was something else entirely. I was the woman who took the vow that mattered most, to never again abandon herself. And that, I knew, was the truest ceremony I would ever attend.